Most history books fail to capture the impact of African Americans in our country's founding era. From military heroes and elected officials to educators and religious leaders, many great Americans have been erased from our national narrative. But today, these lost heroes receive the honor they have long deserved. Join historian David Barton as he traces America's history back to the source in Building on the American Heritage. Uncover the forgotten stories, examine the nation's founding documents, and discover firsthand our Founding Fathers' original intent. Explore the morals and values America was built on centuries ago. Learn the truth of America's past so you can shape America's future. This is Building on the American Heritage.
Well, David, our topic today is Black History in America. We now do February as Black History Month, but it seems like we often only look at the last 40 or 50 years of Black history. What were some of the great Black Americans earlier in our history?
Well, you're right. So much of Black history today focuses from the time of Martin Luther King coming forward, and that's important, guys, really important stuff. But we used to know a whole lot more about our history. We knew of Black Patriots way back at the beginning. Matter of fact, here's a really special book. This is one that came out in 1852, The Services of Colored Americans in the War of 1776 and 1812. Now, there's a book done by William Nell, and by the way, William Nell is the first Black American to have any position in the federal government. And this is his kind of introduction to look at all the Black Patriots we had in the Revolution Wars of 1812. And then he came back 3 years later with a really big book, and this is the book from 3 years later, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, with the stories of service of these distinguished colored patriots. You go through here and there are scores of names out of the American Revolution that we've really never heard about.
Yeah, see, that's already a paradigm shift, because most of the time you think about the Revolution, you think it's a bunch of rich white guys that
you do.
started America.
We used to know the names of the heroes, Black heroes from Bunker Hill or from Yorktown or from Lexington or from Washington Crossing the Delaware. We don't know the Battle of Groton Heights, the Battle of Newport. All these battles were Black heroes, worthy heroes. We don't hear a thing about that. We don't hear a thing about Blacks being elected to office back in the founding era. I mean, 1768, Wentworth Cheswell, church leaders elected to office in New Hampshire. He becomes the historian of New Hampshire. The Great History of New Hampshire by Jeremy Belknap. It was the work of Wentworth Cheswell, Black historian who fed so much of that to him. He was reelected for 49 years to 8 different political offices. I mean, that's fairly significant. We've never heard of Wentworth Cheswell. We don't hear a thing about Thomas Hercules. He's a Black official elected in Pennsylvania in 1793. He was elected in a white area of Pennsylvania by a huge majority of votes. I mean, we never hear even about the voting that happened. In the states like Massachusetts, there was never a time when Blacks couldn't vote in Massachusetts. And if you look even at the Constitution of the United States, you look at what happened in ratifying the Constitution, you have to go through all the states. Never hear about all the Blacks who voted in ratification of the Constitution. I mean, you go into Maryland, you know, in Baltimore, more Blacks than whites voted to ratify the Constitution of the United States.
No idea, you're kidding.
We hear nothing about that. That's not part of what we teach in Black history. We'll start in the 1960s and move forward, but how about all the stuff that happened back in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s?
Well, if you leave all of that out, then you tend to teach both Black and white Americans that Blacks didn't contribute until the 1960s, instead of recognizing they made great contributions from the very beginning.
Oh man, Black inventors, Black scientists, you have Black mathematicians, you have Black soldiers, you have Black sailors. I mean, Robert Smalls, in the Civil War, he's the first Black captain of a military ship, became a general in the Civil War. We'd never heard of Robert Smalls. Became a member of Congress, a Black member of Congress right after the Civil War. I mean, a great story, and we've never heard of him, so we don't see...
Even what you just said, members of Congress, Black members of Congress right after the Civil War.
There's a great lithograph done by Currier and Ives, and it shows the first Blacks elected to Congress. On the far left side sitting there is the first Black U.S. Senator, Hiram Rhodes Rebels. Oh, by the way, he is the Reverend Hiram Rhodes Rebels. He is a preacher of the gospel. He was a missionary. He raised 3 full regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War. I mean, just a great guy. Over on the other side, you see folks like Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey is the first black elected to the House of Representatives. And by the way, he's the first black to preside over the House of Representatives. But we've never talked about these guys. So the other guys there, you got Benjamin Turner, you got Josiah Wall, you got Robert Large, you got Robert Brown Elliott. We don't talk about them in any way, shape, fashion, or form. We just didn't even know that this happened in our history. There's just so many things that have gotten away from our history. And Benjamin Banneker, I love the story of Benjamin Banneker. Got to tell the story because it's so cool. Because Benjamin Banneker, in the founding era, he became a self-taught mathematician and scientist, really incredible guy. But what Benjamin did was, he one time asked his friend to see his pocket watch. Of course, you know, it's a wind-up pocket watch back then. So Benjamin took that pocket watch, turned it over, unscrewed the back off the pocket watch, looked inside, studied it for a while, put the back on it, gave it back to his friend. He went home, he carved a clock out of wood that kept accurate time to within 1 minute a year.
Holy cow.
He
So
saw,
just from looking, all he did was look
exactly.
at it. Didn't even take it apart.
He looked at it and he said, I can do that. Goes home, carves it out of wood. It's incredible. Well, he goes on to teach himself math and science. Thomas Jefferson chose him as one of the 7 guys to lay out in D.C.
You said he taught himself. So
he taught
not
himself.
Formal training. He does this kind of scientific thing. He
would go to his friend Andrew Ellicott and say, do you have any books on math? I want to read some math books. And he would teach himself math and he'd teach himself science. He came up with an almanac that was printed. Now, his almanac came out in the 1790s, a very famous almanac by Benjamin Banneker. And by the way, the guy who helped fund it was James McHenry, signer of the U.S. Constitution, a white guy that wanted to make sure this almanac got out. So he helped raise the funding and get this almanac printed. And Banneker's almanac, now Banneker taught himself science. Benjamin Banneker in that almanac would predict the exact minute of sunrise and sunset even 10 years in advance. His calculations were incredible, and he sent a copy of his almanac to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson gets that and says, this is the proof. Look how brilliant this guy is. He sends it off to the anti-slavery forces in France, said, look, here's a perfect example of a black man. Look at the computations. I think he's the greatest scientist in American history. We've never heard of Benjamin Banneker to any degree. I mean, what a great model he was. And again, black and white, side by side, cooperating. It wasn't racism. I mean, he and Andrew Ellicott and what they did, and Jefferson used, it's good stuff.
But you're giving great examples. If we do go all the way back, Revolutionary War examples, this kid, you know, right after the Revolutionary War, you go all the way through the Civil War, these first members of Congress. If we hold up these examples, we can say to young black Americans, look, you've had a piece of the American dream from the beginning. So how do we get it back into the history books, and how do we get people to go back and read these stories?
Well, guess what? Black history is part of my history because I'm an American and this is part of American
We're living
history.
the benefit of what they did.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so we have to get this back ourselves. And once we get it, we have to pass it on because this will change the paradigm of everyone, black or white, when you see that, you know what? There was some racism back there, but there's a ton of stuff that was such good cooperation between blacks and whites and others. And there's so many positive, uplifting examples. You don't have to choose between Michael Jordan and Dr. King, although both of those are great examples. You have hundreds of uplifting, edifying choices from across American history. And if we don't get back to knowing our own history, we'll never be able to recover the wholesomeness that made America so good.
All right, David, a lot of great questions today on black history in America. Let's get the first one.
Why should I be proud of the Founding Fathers and the Revolution when none of them wanted to end slavery?
This is a question not just from black Americans, but white Americans as well.
Really, it's an element of that deconstruction stuff where we always present the negative about America and we present the exception rather than the rule. Great example, I spoke recently at Southern University Law School, really sharp kids. This is one of the traditional black colleges and universities in America. And so when I was there, I made the comment, said, well, you know, as we know, unfortunately, all of our founding fathers, signers of the Declaration, all a bunch of racists and bigots and slave owners, and that's just one of the bad downsides of America.
Hey, that's what they literally taught me in law school. Why should I listen to anything these guys say?
And that's why I put that out there, and everybody said, yeah, that's right, that's too bad. And I said, oh, by the way, I said, who up there owned slaves? And everybody said, well, Thomas Jefferson did. I said, yeah. Who else owned slaves? They couldn't name anybody else. And I said, so wait a minute, 56 guys there, one owned slaves, so that means they're all slave owners, all racist, all bigots? See, I said, what do you do over here with this man, Benjamin Rush, and this man right here, Ben Franklin? In 1774, as an act of civil disobedience to King George III, they formed the first abolition society in America. The king had said, you can't do that. And they said, watch us. We think God wants blacks to be free. We think all men are equal. So you have two, really what you would call radical abolitionists in these two guys that as an act of civil disobedience start the first abolition society. Now significantly with that, you have to go back into American history where that in 1773, you had a number of the northern colonies especially that started passing anti-slavery laws. You had Rhode Island, 1773 said, that's it, passed an anti-slavery law. 1774, you have Connecticut, you have Pennsylvania, you have all these states starting to pass anti-slavery laws. 1774 is when King George III stepped in and vetoed every American anti-slavery law. At that point, he said, hold it, guys. He said, you're part of the British Empire. We have slavery in the British Empire. As long as you're part of the British Empire, you're going to have slavery. And that's when several founding fathers said, great, let's not be part of the British Empire. And specifically, that's where Benjamin Rush and Ben Franklin said, we're not going to do this. Now, significantly, in the Declaration of Independence, it lists the desire to end slavery twice as often as it lists taxation without representation. We always hear about taxation, we don't hear about the others. That's the kind of attitude that you have throughout the Revolution with so many of the founding fathers. Now, again, not all of them owned slaves. A whole lot of, I mean, John Adams said he would have no slave allowed in his house because slavery was so abominable. Samuel Adams actually freed slaves. People would want to give him a gift. And, hey, what can you give more than a slave? And people would give him a slave. No. As soon as he was given a slave, he freed the slave on the spot. He fought against slavery. You got a lot of founding fathers who never owned slaves, would not own slaves, fought against slavery. There were hardcore abolitionists. But there were others that did have slavery. And by the way, Ben Franklin here, Ben Franklin also joined with this man right here. This guy sitting right there on the edge is Francis Hopkinson. And Ben Franklin and Francis Hopkinson back in 1768 started a whole chain of schools for black Americans to teach black Americans academics and Christianity and the Bible. Now, under British policy, you didn't teach black Americans. That kind of stuff illegal. That'll get you in trouble. Here's two founding fathers signed the Declaration and said, we don't care what the British law is. This is wrong. We're all created equal, and we're going to teach black Americans the same things we teach white Americans, and that is the Bible and Christianity and academics. You also have folks like this man here with the hat. That's Stephen Hopkins. Stephen Hopkins became the first founding father to sign an anti-slavery law after we separated from Great Britain.
It sounds like a lot of these guys not only were not slave owners, they were actively trying to get rid of slavery.
You bet they were.
And even used it as one of the reasons why we wanted to become an independent nation.
You bet they were. Now, the founding fathers point out that the three southern states of Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina were so stridently pro-slavery that during the Revolution, Congress, the way they fought the Revolution was they asked every state to meet kind of a quota. Hey, you've got 5% of the population. Can you provide 5% of the troops in the Continental Army? You've got 25% of the population. So they would try to spread it out where that everybody could participate. But what happened was the founding fathers who represented the Deep South states, those Deep South states never even met their quotas for soldiers, because the plantation owners were so scared to go fight for freedom, they're afraid that if they left the plantation, the slaves might escape. And they would stay home and guard those slaves rather than go out and fight for freedom for their state and their country. So it was northern anti-slavery states, particularly like Connecticut and Massachusetts, that oversupplied soldiers from these anti-slavery states to have enough troops to be able to fight the British. So what you find is among the founding fathers, yeah, there were some pro-slavery guys, there were some slave owners. About 30% of the founding fathers were pro-slavery, but they were the exception, not the rule. And you have lots of guys who did a lot of work to make sure that equal rights in the Declaration of Independence were extended to all Americans, black, white, red, whatever.
Okay, David, how about another question from the audience?
Did black Americans fight on both sides of the Revolutionary War?
Well, so the country was somewhat split, right? I mean, it was white Americans the same way, some were for, some were against. What about black Americans?
There were, and sometimes the situation was not good. A great example is a black man named John Morant. John Morant was from New York. When he was about 11, 12 years old, they moved to South Carolina, and he wanted to study music. And at 12 years old, he was really kind of a child prodigy. He was called on to give concerts all over in South Carolina. And he said that one day as he was going to give a concert, he said he passed by an open pasture, and in the middle of that field, he said there was a crazy man hallooing at the crowd. Turned out the guy in the middle was George Whitefield, and it was one of the meetings in the Great Awakening. And one of the friends with John, who was going to this concert with him, dared him to break up the meeting. Pull out his French horn, crawl up and break up the meeting. You know? So John said, yeah, I'll do that. So John pulls out his French horn, and this young black American goes and he's going to play it and break up the meeting. And just before he did, Whitefield spins and turns and points at him and says, "Prepare to meet thy God."
That'll get your attention.
That'll get your attention. 12-year-old about to blow his French horn, break up a meeting, thinks this is really funny. Well, what happened was John fell over and just hit the ground. And it turns out that that was kind of a common phenomenon in the Great Awakening. And so Whitefield finished a sermon and then went over and got young John by the hand and picked him up and said, "We need to talk." And so Whitefield took him home with him for the next 3 days, shared with him about God having something for him to do and having a plan for him, and you need to find out what God wants you to do. And so after 3 days, John Morant says, "I want to be a Christian. I want to be a preacher." And so he tells his family, here's what's happened. I've become a Christian. I'm going to be a preacher. His family says, "Do not ever set foot in this house again. We don't want somebody like you, a preacher. There's no way you're going to be part of this family." So now here's a 12-year-old black boy out on his own, and what do? And as the American Revolution broke out, the British found him and they impressed him into the British Navy. Remember, impressment was one of the causes for the separation from Great Britain. Great Britain would send their sailors in and just say, you're now a British sailor, you're off, leave your family. And that's what they did with John. Here's a country he loved, here's a country where he was preaching, and the British have now forced him to fight against the Americans.
He's not volunteering.
He's not volunteering. He is forced into British service. And so, yeah, there were blacks fighting on both sides of the Revolution, sometimes not voluntarily.
Okay, David, let's get another question from the audience.
We always hear about Washington and other white heroes of the American Revolution, but didn't black Americans also fight for independence?
It's a great question. Typically, you only see, when we talk about heroes of the American Revolution, it's white Americans that we see in those paintings.
Well, we think it is. This painting over my shoulder is a great example. Washington crossing the Delaware. If you ask people today who's in the boat, other than George Washington, they wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah, that's it.
And yet sitting right up in the front of the boat are two black Americans. You have Oliver Cromwell and you have Prince Whipple, two black Americans who served in the American Revolution. They were with the general staff throughout the American Revolution, served with the general staff. And by the way, that is significant. They served throughout the Revolution. Your term of enlistment back then was 1 year. Well, if you serve the whole Revolution, you re-up 7 times. That's a lot of wanting to serve your country.
Yeah.
And even the story of Prince Whipple, who's there in the front of the boat, really cool guy, is a neat story because his master, if you would, he had been a slave. His master was William Whipple, signer of the Declaration of Independence. And when the war started, Washington contacted Whipple and said, "Hey, I need your help in the military, I need you to come be an officer." And so William Whipple took Prince Whipple, and he didn't consider him a slave. He really was a slave, but he was just part of the family. And so he took Prince, and they're heading off to get with Washington and do the fighting. And William Whipple turns to Prince and says, "Prince," he said, "I hope you'd be really courageous fighting for the liberties of the country." And Prince looked back at William and said, "I could fight a whole lot more if I was fighting for my own freedom." And William looked at him and said, "You're right. Didn't cross my mind. You're free right now. Freedom on the spot."
Oh, wow.
And that's the way it was for a lot of the founding fathers. They had slaves as British citizens. They freed them as Americans. John Jay, who's a huge anti-slavery leader in New York at the time, he wrote the Federalist Papers. He's the Chief Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, appointed by George Washington. He said that prior to the American Revolution, for so many Americans, it never crossed their mind to think of slavery, particularly slavery in New England. There weren't all that many slaves up there, but slaves were more like a part of the family. Now, it was a different view for slaves. I'm not excusing that at all. But when Prince Whipple turned to William and said, "I'd fight a lot more if I was fighting for my own freedom," It's like epiphany. Yeah, of course you would. Oh, what was I thinking? And gave him his freedom on the spot. So here you have Prince Whipple freed by one of the signers of the Declaration who said, yeah, slavery is a bad deal. What was I thinking? And that's the kind of attitude that you have throughout the Revolution with so many of the Founding Fathers. By and large, you know, most were not pro-slavery, but the thing about, we see white Americans, not black. Well, we see George Washington, but we've never been pointed out the two guys in front of the boat are black Americans.
Yeah, I think that will surprise a lot of people
That's
because
right.
they've seen the painting, but they've never been told that there were black Americans.
Well, consider the painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's painted by John Trumbull, founding father who fought in the Revolution. He saw so much of what went on. He painted, actually, he's the guy who painted the signing of the Declaration. John Trumbull painted this. Well, he painted the Battle of Bunker Hill. He paints the hero of Bunker Hill right there in the painting, and nobody ever noticed it because it's a black guy. It's a black patriot named Peter Salem. Peter Salem was the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And you see in the painting, he's standing right there beside Thomas Grosvenor. And I love that image, black and white, standing side by side, fighting for the freedom of their country. Peter Salem received more than a dozen military commendations for what he did at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was presented to the commander-in-chief as the hero of Bunker Hill. They built monuments to Peter Salem, black patriot. We've never even heard
I was
his
about to
name
say, I
today.
don't think we teach that at all.
Oh, no. Who knows who Peter Salem
Yeah.
is? As a matter of fact, in the last 20 years, all these academics say, no, that's not Peter Salem. That is the slave of Thomas Grosvenor. They don't even know if he owns a slave or not. I mean, the thing is, oh, it can't be a free black. It can't be a patriot black. There was oppression all over America. No, there was oppression in some colonies. In other colonies, it was a radically different era, a civil rights kind of attitude. And you have that in Connecticut. Connecticut's one of the anti-slavery states. Once they got free from Great Britain, no slavery. You have the same thing with Massachusetts. You have the same thing with New Hampshire and Vermont. All these states that ended slavery once they got out from under British control.
Well, certainly if you had guys like you pointed out earlier that's re-upped seven
That's
times,
right.
if they only had to fight a year to be free, clearly they were fighting for more than just their individual freedom.
Well, talking about re-upping several times, another black soldier that was that way was a guy named Lemuel Haynes. Now I have here a very rare sermon. This is by Lemuel Haynes. And you see here the Lemuel Haynes at the bottom. Lemuel Haynes is a very special black American. Lemuel Haynes is actually the first black American to receive any higher degree of education. Got a master's degree from Middlebury College, but he also was a pastor. He pioneered churches all over New England. And quite frequently, he was the black pastor of a white church. He sometimes was black pastor of a black church, but often black pastor of a white church. But he had been one of the Minutemen down at the early part of the Revolution with Lexington and Concord and all the things that happened there. And he re-upped in the Revolution several times. And so he serves in the early stages of the Revolution, and such was his love for his country and for his commander-in-chief, George Washington, and for the Revolution, that in his pulpits in New England, on George Washington's birthday every year, he would preach a special sermon on his commander-in-chief, George Washington, with whom he had served in the American Revolution. So there is a black who is a great leader, a great educated man, pioneered churches all over New England. He's not a slave. Another really fun painting deals with James Armistead. Now, we would never recognize James Armistead. Matter of fact, the painting that you see is of Lafayette, the young French general at the Battle of Yorktown. Yorktown's the final battle in the American Revolution, and you got young General Marquis de Lafayette, really good patriot. He loved America. He used his own wealth and resources to bring the French Navy and French soldiers come help and be our allies.
And we teach about him.
And
We've
we
heard
teach
of
about him.
Sure.
He's definitely covered in the textbooks. But standing right there beside him with the horse, you see the black guy standing there. Who's that black guy? Oh, that's his slave. That's who that is. No. That is James Armistead, a really good friend of Marquis de Lafayette. And James Armistead, that black patriot standing right there, is the hero of the Battle of Yorktown. Really cool story the way it happened. James Armistead, black patriot, comes to Marquis de Lafayette, friends with Marquis de Lafayette, General Lafayette, and says, I want to do something to serve my country. And Marquis de Lafayette says, well, the problem we've got right now is we don't have good intelligence of what's going on inside the British camp. And we just don't know what they're doing until after they've done it. And if we could get some kind of information from inside the camp fed back to us, it would really help us. He said, really dangerous assignment. And so what happened was James Armistead went straggling over to the British camp there at Yorktown and went straggling and says, oh, these terrible, mean Americans. I hate the Americans. They so abuse me. They so mistreat me. Would you kind British take me in and take care of me? And so what they did was they took James Armistead and assigned him to be the servant to British General Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, wait, he's the traitor. Yeah, he's the traitor in America that switched over to the British side. So he switches over to the British side. Now he's a British general, and James Armistead has been assigned to be a servant to him. So James serves him faithfully, takes his meals, whatever he needs. Well, General Benedict Arnold's all the time meeting with the other British generals and with Lord Cornwallis, head of all the British forces. And so that means that James is all the time going with the other generals. He's hearing everything going on. Let's move 5,000 troops over here. Let's set up artillery. And every night he feeds this information back to Lafayette. He said they're about to move 5,000 troops. They're setting up artillery. Every night, get good information back. So Washington, all the troops know what's happening with the British. Well, after faithfully serving the British for a while, Lord Cornwallis came to James, really impressed with James, came to him and said, James, would you consider being a spy for us against the Americans? He said, I know you hate the Americans and they really mistreated you, but would you be a spy for us? And you know, James is like, I don't know, those Americans, well, if you want me to, I'll be a spy. So what you have is Lafayette has a relationship with him and Cornwallis thinks he has a relationship. What happens is Armistead feeds all this bad information to Cornwallis, all the good information to Washington and Lafayette. We end up trapping the British out on the peninsula, get them cut off, and Armistead, the hero of the first double spy in American history, cut much off the American Revolution, saved scores of American lives. A really cool story about the guy in the painting, James Armistead, and we've never heard of this guy.
When you say he's the hero of Yorktown, I mean, that's where we win, right?
That's where we
win.
That is it. Otherwise, the thing would have kept going for a long time. So after the Revolution, when it's all over and won, and Armistead's really been the hero, Lafayette goes back to France because the reason he came is it's now settled and done. So in France, and by the way, he fights for liberty in France, but he ends up being thrown in the prison. He's in the Bastille, and so they imprison him because he wants liberty for France and doesn't get it, and so all sorts of stuff going on, which really ticked the Americans off. Because here's this guy who came to fight for their liberty, now he gets back home and gets in prison, spent years in prison. When he finally got out of the Bastille, by the way, he took a key to the door of the Bastille and mailed it to George Washington, said, I want you to have the symbol of our freedom here in France. We've got rid of the torture in the dungeon, the Bastille. Nonetheless, as Lafayette starts growing old, he recognizes, I will die before too long. I need to make a farewell tour of America. I need to go back, all the friends I had. And he was a hero in America. If you look inside the U.S. Capitol, there are two paintings inside the House of Representatives, the Capitol. One is George Washington, and the other is Marquis de Lafayette. And as you look at the painting, it's a really old guy. It's not the same Marquis de Lafayette we had at Yorktown. It's a very old guy. And he came back in 1824. So essentially, we're talking nearly 50 years after the Revolution. He's come back. And he was still such a hero that as he toured all the way across America, crowds, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands would show up to cheer him. They made ribbons with Lafayette on it, etc. Well, as he's in this massive crowd in Richmond, Virginia, having been gone now from America for well over 40 years, he looks across the crowd and he sees James Armistead, recognizes him instantly, runs across, they embrace each other. You know, great picture again, black and white, but for him to pick out somebody he hadn't seen in 40 years, a black hero and a black friend and a black patriot, it's a really cool story with James Armistead.